Resources I've compiled here are from a couple of different resources that have been created by different organizations. One is from Hold the Line, which I commend to you. You can go to holdthelineguide.com to read the whole guide. And the second resource is The Anti-Coup by Gene Sharp and Bruce Jenkins. So those are both kind of sprinkled liberally throughout this presentation. I want to begin by sharing briefly 3 scenarios that the Hold the Line team, which is a grassroots group from across the country of concerned activists. These are 3 election scenarios that they have distilled based on the copious research. You may have read, there was an Atlantic article that went out looking at all the different ways the election could play out. There was essentially a war games team of senior officials from there were dozens of folks who came together and looked at all the ways the election could transpire. What the Hold the Line team did is they said, what are the 3 scenarios that are most likely to play out in the next, and really the 100 days from election day until inauguration? And these are the 3 election scenarios that they determined were most worthy of being planned for. The first is that election day results are unclear, and Trump declares himself the victor anyway. So this looks like people expecting an election night declaration and Trump playing into that narrative. Folks come to expect that this is what we do in this country. We get the election results on the night of, and Trump taking advantage of that. The second is that the election results might show significant unexplained irregularities and or signs of tampering, and Trump declares victory. So this is a narrative that we're already begin to hear play out, where Trump is setting the grounds for declaring a fraudulent election based on mail-in ballots and his belief that these are a fraudulent practice. So this would be after election day itself. And then finally, Trump loses the election. This is the landslide scenario in which it is very apparent that Trump has lost, but he simply refuses to leave. What's important to know about all of these scenarios is that when we are talking about these, we are talking about a coup. And it's important to use that language because if we talk about a fraudulent election or we talk about an illegitimate election, that doesn't get people's attention in the same way that a coup does. A coup does not require military intervention. A coup is a scenario in which somebody takes power extra constitutionally. So any of these would be a coup. The Hold the Line team looked at each of these scenarios and they said, there are specific actions that can be taken and specific narratives that we can lean into as we the people to contest these ways of seizing power. So the first is that if election day results are unclear and Trump declares himself the victor night of or shortly thereafter, the line 1 defense, which we can begin planning and organizing for now in our communities, is insisting that all votes be counted without interference or intimidation. So a couple ways that we can act on this in our communities. The action that Hold the Line is organizing, that you can get more information from their guide, is that we can secure pledges from election officials and public servants. So we can go to our mayors, we can go to the civil servants, we can go to those who are in charge of the electoral process and have them sign public pledges that they are going to ensure that every vote will be counted, that there won't be any voter intimidation, that they will have law enforcement there to ensure that people are not intimidated by brown shirts, by folks who are responding to the stand back and stand by call that Trump made at the debate recently. So you'll find from Hold the Line that they have pledges for both election officials as well as for folks in law enforcement, that they will hold the constitutional line and that if Trump declares himself victor, that they will fulfill their constitutional duty by waiting until there is a completed election. The messaging here and this comes from a group called More in Common. So they've done copious research around what messaging is most effective at this time. What they discovered is most effective for this line is the idea of urging patience as a duty. Those two ideas, patience and duty. So insisting that folks recognize that this election is not simply a day, it's a season. And here I've included a verse from the Psalms that felt very appropriate. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret over those who prosper in their way, over those who carry out evil devices. So this is a strong thread in our own tradition of waiting on God, of trusting that God's plans are better than our plans, and that we can lean into that as we help people cast a different vision for what this election season will entail. Second scenario. This is the one in which there are signs of tampering. Ballot boxes have been stolen. There's been significant impediment of voting at the polls, and Trump declares himself the victor anyway. So here the narrative is that incidents of fraud, voter suppression, or other election irregularities must be investigated impartially and remedies as appropriate. This can be done effectively, especially at a local level. So again, this involves our local officials. So friends, as clergy with connections to those in your local government, this is a great place to use those relationships you've cultivated. Lean into those relationships to be able to ask folks and have them sign a public pledge to fulfill their constitutional duty by counting all the votes, and to investigate if there are issues of irregularity, if there are issues of tampering with ballot boxes or anything else along those lines. The messaging here is a narrative of truth. So what's important to emphasize is that this is not about partisanship. This is about our democracy surviving and, Lord willing, flourishing into the future, and that we can't have a healthy democracy if we don't have truth. And as the gospel according to John reminds us, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Or as Jesus reminds us in the Synoptic Gospels, everything that's been in the dark will be brought to the light. Everything that's been hidden will be made known. So emphasizing that this cannot be a moral election unless it is one that is truthful. And finally, our third line to hold. This is about respecting the true election results, regardless of who wins, because preserving democracy is more important than any individual candidate. I'll talk about these two concepts in a moment, but the action here is about delegitimization and non-cooperation. And the messaging that for me felt appropriate as someone from the Episcopal tradition comes from the baptismal covenant that we say, that we frequently invoke, in which we promise to strive for justice and peace among all people and to respect the dignity of every human being. And so in this case, respecting the dignity of every human being means we count every vote because we believe that every person has value. So it's not about any one individual, it's about us. It's about the whole, it's about the body of Christ. Okay. So two objectives in the event of a stolen election. This comes from Gene Sharp and Bruce Jenkins' work in the anti-coup. The first is delegitimization. The second is non-cooperation. What is delegitimization? Well, the thing is that people who seize power are dependent upon legitimacy. That is, they're reliant on people to accept that they are morally and politically in the right and that they have authority to rule. And they also have a tendency to rely on endorsements. We've seen this time and again with this president. He is highly reliant upon endorsements from religious leaders, among others. And so clergy wield enormous moral authority to deny legitimacy to somebody who might try to illegitimately steal power, which again, the word for that is a coup, by a would-be dictator by denouncing them. I didn't finish my list here, but we'll get more into that later. There's a lot of different ways that could look: refusing to participate in state liturgies, refusing to name somebody in your prayers, actively engaging in sermons of dissent. There's a lot of ways this can look. And then non-cooperation is about defending the society. So oftentimes people think about government buildings being really important in the event of a coup, but in fact, points of geography are not that important. So the Senate, for example, could continue to meet on Zoom if a coup takes place and people refuse to leave. The Senate could shift power and it could still wield authority constitutionally, even as extra constitutional endeavors are happening within the halls of the Capitol building or within the White House building. Legitimate government could still play out. So non-cooperation is focused on direct defense of institutions, of society, and of our freedoms. So here's some examples of what general resistance could look like. So if this president refuses to leave, in the event that he has clearly not won the election, but he refuses to leave, or any of those three scenarios play out, here are three of the, not three, here are a few of the methods of general resistance that people could be encouraged widely to engage in, right? People could participate in a stay at home. This is important because there is a tendency to flood the streets in the event of an extreme political takeover, which a coup is. The problem with that is that if there is military involved in that coup being successful, it could be very dangerous to go into the streets. So it's a question of what's strategic. So a stay-at-home can be more successful at times than flooding the streets in a demonstration, refusing to go out and play out life as usual. Paralysis of the political system. So this looks like, again, using those relationships with civil servants. Will you refuse to cooperate with the new orders you're receiving from this extra constitutional regime? It also looks like people who are in those civil servant positions continuing to operate business as usual by the Constitution and by the rules as they were previously. It can look like filling the streets with demonstrators. It can also look like leaving the streets empty. Subversion of troops is about what I mentioned earlier. It's about getting folks to agree to fulfill their constitutional duty, and then being able to say to those folks, hey, you're acting extra constitutionally in violation of what you promised to do to fulfill your duties in the military, in the National Guard, what have you. So this is often about a matter of persuading people. Defiant publication of dissenting media. So what often happens in the event of a coup is that the regime that is trying to take over takes over the airwaves. We've actually, this is very relevant for what's happening tonight. So tonight, Trump is having his NBC town hall meeting. And there's been a lot of anger about the fact that he is doing this simultaneous to Joe Biden. This is already a sign of in which our media, one of our media outlets, is playing into the hands of a would-be dictator. But defiant publication looks like journalists who refuse to engage in propaganda and continue to publish truthful stories and to exercise the right of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. A general strike can be really powerful, as can an economic shutdown. But what's important to note here is that these are methods that are best played out quickly and not for long periods of time, because you want to maintain the resources that you have if you're going to need to fight this fight for a long time. But these can be powerful ways, if enough people are participating, for the prevention economically of a takeover by an unwanted regime. So that was general resistance. Then we have organized resistance, and this is what I actually want to focus more on for us as clergy. These are acts that focus on a specific event or occur in a specific place or take place at a designated time. So general resistance you might think of as, here's the template that you give your people, here are the general things that you can engage in as a citizen. Organized resistance is about saying we are going to plan and strategize and choose some of these tactics that we're going to engage in at a specific time. We're going to escalate them in this specific way, at this specific order, etc. So just a few examples of some of these, and you can reference a lot more of these from Gene Sharp in his 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action. But a few examples: demonstrations, short strikes, tolling of church bells. All the churches across your town toll at the same time, or even across the country. defiant flying of national flags. I know my church has a flag in the sanctuary. Perhaps it's not even flying it. Maybe we take it down. Simultaneous reading and religious service of official statements. We all engage that at the same time. Organized hunger strikes and expressions of mourning, which I'll have another example of shortly. In all of these things, it's really important to note that the theory of change hangs on a grand strategy of nonviolent struggle or civil resistance. This is because in the event of a coup, violence always lurks close. And so it's important to know that nonviolence is the best method that we have at our disposal to prevent greater casualties. It's not to say there won't be suffering, there won't be even death, but nonviolent struggle is the best way that we have to prevent there being greater casualties. Sharp and Jenkins note that repressive measures are not decisive unless they invoke fear and submission in the defenders. So the question is not, again, whether there will be violence. The likelihood I've heard from every training I've attended is that there will be, whether that is government sanctioned or it's extra governmental, coming from folks who are responding to being empowered by this president. There will be violence. The likelihood is very high. So the question is, how will we make that repression backfire? How will we cause that violence to not have the desired effect? It's important to know that when violence does happen, even if it's not violence toward the bodies of those who are perceived as the oppressor, right? So it doesn't have to be violence against police or against soldiers or against politicians, even if it is acting against property, that can be perceived as justifying overwhelming oppression. And so oftentimes what we see is a crackdown from military forces. We see a call for law and order, which we've seen in Portland and other cities. And at the most extreme, we see a declaration of a state of emergency or martial law. And we could even see the declaration of the use of the Insurrection Act, which would allow this president to send our own troops into our communities. So that's what we're trying to avoid. We're also trying to make sure that we are able to rebuff agents provocateurs, which is when folks who are stirring up violence are sent in masquerading as members of the resistance, and they're stirring up chaos and they're causing havoc by breaking windows or throwing water bottles. It's important to be able to rebuff those folks. So the commitment then is to nonviolent discipline. And this can cause repression to backfire. If we are committed to showing up and not engaging with violence, we can make repression backfire by increasing the number of people who are sympathetic to us because our cause is seen as just and we're seen as the ones who are being acted upon with violence. So that can increase the number of people participating in our movement. It can also sow doubts and reservations among those who are troops, those who are police, those who are supporters of the coup, because it's so clear again that there's this dichotomy of those who are causing violence and those who are protesting nonviolently. And finally, it can arouse international opposition to the coup. It's important to note here, coups crystallize within 48 hours. So the reason why we're doing this training and the reason so many other organizations are taking this very seriously is because we don't have time to call in the cavalry. There's no one else coming to save us from this worst case scenario. By the time you've aroused international opposition, you have yourself a dictator, generally speaking. And so they may be able to send assistance in different ways, but at that point, it generally is too late for them to do anything meaningful. It has to be us. All right, so a few specific tactics. Now that I've mentioned delegitimization and non-cooperation, here's some examples of things that we can brainstorm that we might engage in as clergy. The first is mock funerals for democracy. Mock funerals have been used successfully in many countries that are trying to overthrow dictators. Sometimes they're funerals that are done for those in power. Sometimes they're funerals that are done for people who are being disappeared. This is a pretty widely used tactic. But the idea here would be to use something that is in our tool belt, as it were, as liturgists, as people um, who are acting as funeral officiants and have this in our tool belt. So a mock funeral for democracy could serve a couple of purposes. It would be a delegitimization tactic. So it's not a non-cooperation tactic. It's one that is focused on making it clear that we don't support the person in power, the would-be dictator, that we don't endorse that person. And then it's symbolic. It's a symbolic tactic. So it is not pushing for a specific action so much as it is arousing the sympathy of people who would agree, but maybe too scared to say so. And I should say, she can add a bit about this later, but Justice Junior has been working on developing some liturgies that could be used for this tactic. Sermons of dissent. So the idea here would be reading sermons from Nazi Germany, from the Confessing Church as they resisted Hitler, or from South America, perhaps, during the Liberation Theology movement, folks who were speaking openly against dictators, against people in power, abusing that power. Again, this could be coordinated at a specific time so that it would be clear that this is a mass organized tactic. This is a delegitimization tactic as well, but it could also be a non-cooperation tactic if it is advocating for nonviolent resistance. So if it is empowering folks in a specific way to get engaged, then it is also non-cooperation. And then finally, a third example of a way that clergy could participate in delegitimization is with the withdrawal of public liturgical support. So we, in many of our churches, and including in my parish at times, pray for the president. So one tactic would be to withdraw support symbolically by refusing to pray for the president, by taking that out, erasing that from our liturgies. A really prominent way in which public liturgical support plays out is at the National Cathedral. Every 4 years, we have a national prayer service. And so one thought has been to push that community, those clergy, to pledge to refuse to hold that service in the event that this president illegitimately claims power. Those are events, both small with our own liturgies in which we pray for the president, and large with the National Prayer Service, in which the power of this president is effectively legitimized. So one last slide, and then we'll have a chance to discuss. One thing that a number of organizations have emphasized is the importance of pledges. Pledges are important because, again, we don't know if this worst case scenario will play out, but what is a matter of the utmost importance is the capacity to move quickly. And pledges have been shown across the world in instances like this, that when the pledges have been made, folks are able to move faster because they have said and committed to a specific set of actions. So this is a proposed election protection pledge for clergy, which we can talk about, and we'll make this as well as other resources available on the website. But a few things here to kind of sum up what I've talked about as we move into this election season. 1, we will vote. 2, we will refuse to accept election results until all votes are counted. 3, we will delegitimize illegitimate claims on power through sermons of dissent, subversive liturgy, for example, omission of the would-be dictator's name from public prayer, mock funerals for democracy, and other nonviolent methods. 4, we will urge our church members to regard a coup as an immoral attack on constitutional democracy. Again, the importance of using that language. And 5, We will urge our members to apply their beliefs by refusing to give any legitimacy to the would-be dictatorship, refusing all cooperation and obedience to it, and instead to participate actively in anti-coup defense. So this has been a lot. I realize that this is a great deal of content. And again, this is me trying to distill about 5 trainings into 20, 30 minutes. But I welcome the chance to engage in a bit of conversation at this time.